This is how alliances end, not with war, but with words that leave no room to step back. Greenland, an island of ice, of history, of sovereignty, and now a test of whether diplomacy still works in a world shaped by Donald Trump. In a normal world, diplomats talk, they de-escalate, they search for language that preserves dignity on all sides. That happened this week, quietly, between Denmark, Greenland, and the United States. But outside the room, the president spoke louder, clearer, more dangerous. Ownership and control of Greenland is an absolute necessity. Anything less is unacceptable. When one side declares surrender as the only acceptable outcome, diplomacy doesn't fail, it becomes impossible. If this analysis helps you see the bigger picture behind today's headlines, stay with me, because this story isn't really about Greenland. It's about what happens when power stops listening. And to understand that, we have to slow down and define the problem itself. That's where we go next. This is not a misunderstanding, not a negotiation gone wrong, not a messaging problem. This is a collision between two worldviews. On one side is Denmark, a NATO ally, a state operating inside rules, treaties, and international law. On the other is Donald Trump, a president who treats geopolitics like leverage, like real estate, like a zero-sum deal where one side wins by making the other yield. The Europeans came to Washington to lower the temperature, to acknowledge legitimate US security concerns in the Arctic, to talk about climate change opening new sea lanes, to keep the alliance intact. But Trump wasn't negotiating conditions. He was declaring an outcome. Greenland in the hands of the United States. Anything else, he said, is unacceptable. That single sentence defines the problem, because diplomacy requires options, and Trump has erased all but one. When outcomes are fixed and demands are absolute, process no longer matters. Meetings become theater. Allies become obstacles. To see how we got here, we need to go back, not just to Trump's first term, but to the origin of this fixation itself. This story didn't begin with strategy papers or military briefings. It began with a map. By Trump's own telling, he was staring at one, admiring scale, admiring size. I love maps. Look at the size of this. It's massive. That should be part of the United States. According to journalists Peter Baker and Susan Glasser, the idea may have first surfaced in a casual conversation with a billionaire friend. No doctrine, no committee, just instinct. But instincts at the top of power don't stay personal for long. They force the system to adapt. Greenland isn't just big, it's the largest island in the world. And as climate change melts Arctic ice, what was once frozen geography becomes active terrain. New shipping lanes, new military calculations, new attention. That's where policy begins to chase impulse. Staff look for reasons, allies are briefed, narratives are constructed. Rare earth minerals, strategic positioning, Russian and Chinese presence in the Arctic. All of these are real, but they came after the desire, not before it. And when personal fascination hardens into national demand, history tells us something critical. The first crisis is never the last. That's when pressure starts. Pressure doesn't arrive with tanks. It arrives with visits, with statements, with options. Last March, J.D. Vance arrived in Greenland. Not as a tourist, not by accident. He came with his wife. He came to a place where the United States already has a military base. He came to signal interest without saying the word demand. That was the moment things shifted, because symbols matter, and allies noticed them. Soon after, Reuters reported something more troubling. The administration had considered a plan, a referendum, independence from Denmark, sweetened with cash, tens of thousands of dollars for every Greenlander. Not aid, not investment, a transaction. This wasn't diplomacy. It was leverage dressed up as choice. Greenland's Prime Minister Jens Frederik Nielsen responded plainly. His country would rather remain as it is than become part of the United States. That answer closed a door, and Trump does not respond well to closed doors. At the White House, his language hardened. Whether they like it or not, the easy way or the hard way. If you're still listening, you already sense what's coming. Because when pressure fails, escalation follows. And next, we need to talk about what's really driving this system underneath. What looks like impulse is actually a pattern. Trump doesn't operate inside institutions. He bends institutions around himself. When an idea takes hold, the system reorganizes to justify it, not to question it, not to slow it down. That's the hidden mechanism at work here. First comes fixation, then comes rationalization, then comes coercion. You can see it in how the argument for Greenland evolved. It stopped being about curiosity. It became about necessity, national security, rare earth minerals, China, Russia, the Arctic. Each argument sounds reasonable on its own. Together, they form a post hoc logic, a policy built backward from a predetermined conclusion. Inside this system, diplomacy isn't a tool for compromise, it's a tool for compliance. That's why meetings don't change outcomes, why allied objections are treated as resistance, why sovereignty becomes negotiable only for the weaker party. When Trump says ownership and control, he's not speaking metaphorically. He's describing hierarchy. And hierarchy doesn't allow equals, it allows obedience. Once you understand that, something else becomes clear. This story cannot stabilize on its own, because systems like this don't de-escalate, they test limits. And the next limit is far more dangerous than Greenland itself. The second crisis didn't arrive quietly. It arrived in public, on cameras, in absolutes. Last spring, Trump was asked a simple question. Would he rule out the use of force against Denmark? He didn't. That moment mattered, because ambiguity is a weapon when power is unequal. Soon after, Stephen Miller, the White House Deputy Chief of Staff, said the quiet part out loud. Nobody is going to fight the United States militarily over the future of Greenland. That wasn't analysis. It was a threat wrapped in certainty. Then came the image, posted by the official White House X account, a meme. On one side, Greenland bathed in light, aligned with America, prosperous, secure. On the other, darkness, Russia, China, decline. Notice who wasn't there. Denmark, erased from the equation entirely. This is how escalation works now, not through declarations of war, but through narrative force. When the most powerful country in the world frames your future as a binary choice it controls, neutrality disappears. So does trust. At this point, the crisis is no longer diplomatic, it's psychological, and its consequences land first on ordinary people. That's where this becomes personal. If you live in Greenland, this isn't theory, it's not strategy, it's not a headline, it's your home. You wake up to discover that powerful people are debating your future without you, that your land is described as an asset, that your identity is reduced to leverage. You're told this is about security, about protection, about opportunity. But no one asks how it feels to be pressured by an ally. No one explains why your consent is optional. When leaders speak of the easy way and the hard way, you hear something else. You hear inevitability. You hear threat. And if you're in Denmark, you feel it too. A NATO ally, a partner for decades, suddenly treated as an obstacle. Trust doesn't collapse overnight. It erodes, one statement at a time. If you've ever wondered how ordinary people end up trapped between great powers, this is how it starts. Not with invasion, with normalization. If this resonates with you, pause for a moment. share this analysis, because understanding power is the first defense against it. And now we have to widen the lens, because what's happening here doesn't stop in the Arctic. What happens in Greenland doesn't stay in Greenland, because alliances are systems, and when one fracture appears, others feel it. Across Europe, governments are watching closely, not just what Trump wants, but how he pursues it. The European Parliament didn't mince words. It called the administration's statements a blatant challenge to international law, a violation of the UN Charter, an attack on the sovereignty of a NATO ally. That language matters because Europe understands history. If the United States can coerce territory from Denmark, then the moral line separating allies from adversaries dissolves. It becomes harder to condemn Russia's attempt to annex Ukraine by force, harder to defend a rules-based order when rules bend for power. Quietly, contingency plans emerge. Discussions of invoking a mutual defense clause inside the European Union, unthinkable just years ago. This is how geopolitical shockwaves travel, not through armies first, but through doubt. Doubt about guarantees, doubt about promises, doubt about whether the post-war order still exists. And once doubt sets in, the future splits, not into one path, but several. That's what we need to confront next. From here, the future doesn't move in a straight line. It branches. There are 3 paths ahead, each shaped by the same force: how long pressure continues without resistance. First scenario, restraint. Trump backs away without admitting retreat. The rhetoric cools. Greenland stays Danish. The alliance survives, damaged but intact. This is the least dramatic outcome and the least consistent with what we've seen so far. Second scenario, prolonged coercion. No invasion, no purchase, just endless pressure, diplomatic isolation, economic incentives, narrative warfare. Greenland exists in limbo. Europe adapts by hedging against America itself. Third scenario, rupture. Trump chooses the hard way. Force or its credible threat enters the equation. NATO breaks. The moral distinction between democratic power and authoritarian conquest collapses. History tells us something uncomfortable. Systems don't choose the moderate path by accident. They drift toward the logic already embedded inside them. And this system has erased compromise from the menu. Which means the final question isn't about Greenland. It's about what kind of world replaces diplomacy when surrender becomes policy. That's where we end. This is how norms collapse. Not all at once, but one demand at a time. In a normal world, Wednesday's meeting would have mattered. Words would have softened edges. Allies would have found a face-saving exit. But this is not a normal world. When a president says the only acceptable outcome is Greenland in the hands of the United States, diplomacy has already ended. What remains is timing. Denmark cannot surrender. Greenland has said no. Europe cannot pretend this is rhetoric. So the question isn't if consequences come, it's when. When power refuses limits, it teaches others to do the same. When allies are coerced, alliances hollow out. When rules bend for the strong, they disappear for everyone else. If America crosses this line, the world will remember. Not the speeches, not the meetings, the precedent. If this analysis helped you see what's really at stake, share it, talk about it, because silence is how pressure wins. And if you want to understand where this system goes next, stay with me. This story isn't over.